On the afternoon of June 23rd, 2018, 12 boys from a junior football team called the Wild Boars followed their assistant coach into a cave in northern Thailand. For a little while, it probably felt like the kind of adventure boys remember for years. Their bikes were left outside. Their bags were dropped near the entrance. Above them, the mountains stood still. The cave stretched inward, cool and dim, with stone walls sweating moisture and the ground narrowing under their feet as they went deeper. They were between 11 and 16 years old enough to be brave, yet young enough to believe they still had plenty of daylight. With them was 25-year-old assistant coach Ekafon Kanthawong. None of them knew that the rain had already started to turn against them. And none of the people waiting at home knew that this ordinary outing after football practice was about to become one of the most watched rescue missions on Earth. The cave system they entered was Tam Luang Nong Non, beneath a mountain range near Mae Sai in Chiang Rai province, close to the border with Myanmar. It was not a simple cave you walk into and back out of. It was a long limestone system with twisting tunnels, narrow passages, sudden drops, muddy chambers, and sections that completely flood when a monsoon starts pushing water into the mountain. There was a warning sign at the entrance advising people not to enter during the rainy season. But late June sits right on that dangerous edge, a time when weather can shift fast, and what looks manageable 1 hour can become a death trap the next. Inside the cave, routes that were dry on the way in can disappear under rushing brown water on the way out. That's exactly what happened to the boys and their coach. Rain fell hard enough to flood the passage behind them. By the time they understood the way back was gone, retreat had already stopped being an option. The team was made up of boys with nicknames that sounded bright and playful against the weight of what was coming. Titan, Mick Dom, Pong Mark, Turn, BIW, Dull Note, Nick T, and Knight. Their given names were Chanan Waibun Rungrong, Fanymat Sengdi, Duang Phet Frumthep, Somphon Chai Wong, Munkon Bunpiam, Nat Hao Thakam Song, Ekarat Wong Sukshan, Adel Samon, Prachak Southam, Phiphat Foti, Fonchai Kamluang, and Firafat Samphiankai. Some were stateless, children from border region families whose lives were already shaped by uncertainty in ways most viewers around the world would only learn later. Their assistant coach, Ekafon, was also stateless at the time and had once lived as a Buddhist monk. Those facts would matter later, when people try to understand how the group endured the wait and why. In those first crucial days, panic did not completely consume them. But on that first evening, the boys were not symbols. They were just tired kids underground, with water rising behind them and no clear path back to the entrance. Around 7 that night, concerns started spreading above ground. The team's head coach, Naparat Kanthawong, noticed about 20 missed calls from parents whose sons had not returned home. He tried calling assistant coach Ekafon and several of the boys, but got nowhere. Then, he reached one boy who had separated from the group after practice, and the pieces fell into place quickly and horribly. The rest of the team had gone to Tam Luang. He rushed to the cave entrance and found the abandoned bicycles and bags. Water was already seeping over the muddy approach. In scenes like that, dread doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in layers. First confusion, then urgency, then the awful moment when objects left behind begin telling the story before any person can. Those bicycles outside the cave mouth, still and ownerless in the wet evening air, became the first image of a crisis that was about to stretch across 18 days. Inside the mountain, the boys and their coach were moving farther from the entrance, forced inward by water that kept climbing and flowing where open ground had been. They left behind whatever food they couldn't carry as they fled the flood. In caves, there is no horizon, no sky to tell you whether time is passing normally. There's only your own breathing, the scrape of shoes, the slap of water, and the way darkness seems to lean heavily against your face. They eventually reached an elevated area deep inside the system, roughly 4 kilometers from the cave mouth, a small strip of survivable ground surrounded by absolute danger. There, with no food and no clear idea of when anyone might reach them, the 13 huddled together and waited. The water dripping from the cave walls became their only source of drinking water. Hunger hollowed them out. The mud was freezing. The air was thin and stale. And every hour they remained in that chamber raised the same terrible question. Would help come in time, or would the cave close around them completely before the outside world could find a way in? Ekafon's role during those days became one of the emotional anchors of the entire story. Much later, after the rescue, some people tried to assign blame for bringing the boys into the cave at all, but what happened after they were trapped is just as important. Ekaphon was said to have guided the boys in meditation, drawing on his background as a former monk to help keep them calm and conserve energy. That matters more than it might sound at first. Survival underground wasn't only about water and geography. It was also about fear management. 12 boys in total darkness, hungry and soaked, can spiral into panic fast, and panic burns energy, oxygen, and hope. Instead, the group stayed together. They rationed movement. They tried to rest. They waited. You can picture them in that chamber, knees pulled close, listening to the cave drip and breathe around them. Try not to think too hard about parents above ground or the terrifying possibility that no one could reach this far in. The coach could not feed them. He could not drain the cave, but he could help hold the line inside their minds. And that wisdom may have saved lives before any diver ever touched the water. Above ground, what began as a local emergency rapidly grew into something much larger. Search teams came, then more teams, then specialists from outside Thailand. The problem was immediate and brutal. The cave was completely flooded. Visibility was zero. Water was pushing through narrow, twisting passages with immense force. The route inward was not a straight line, but a submerged maze. Divers had to feel their way through mud-clouded water, passing through constricted sections where even experienced cave rescuers could not move casually. Pumping water out helped, but monsoon conditions kept fighting every bit of progress. People searched for alternative entrances. They explored the mountain from above. They drilled. They laid lines. They hauled in oxygen tanks, ropes, pumps, lights, radios, medical gear, and food for the people mounting the operation. This stopped being a rescue attempt conducted by a handful of local responders. It became a massive multinational effort involving as many as 10,000 people. More than 100 divers, around 100 government agencies, 900 police officers, 2,000 soldiers, 10 police helicopters, 7 ambulances, hundreds of air tanks, and the pumping of more than 1 billion liters of water out of the cave system. For days, the world watched without the comfort of a confirmed outcome. The boys were alive somewhere inside, or they weren't. Rescuers were getting closer, or they weren't. News coverage filled the gap with maps, cave diagrams, clips of rain-soaked command posts, and shots of volunteers carrying hoses and cylinders through thick mud. But the real fight was still happening in total darkness, where cameras could not go. Divers pushed in and out, laying guidelines farther into the cave. Every meter gain mattered. Every delay raised the pressure. Families waited above ground under tarps and temporary shelters. The mountain seemed to absorb all human effort without giving anything back. Then, on July 2nd, after 9 agonizing days underground, 2 British cave divers named John Volanthen and Rick Stanton reached the ledge where the group had taken refuge. The whole story changed in a single exchange that the world would hear again and again. The boys did not greet those divers with panic. They greeted them with voices thin, tired, but alive. In the video from that moment, the divers' lamps catch faces emerging from the pitch black, and the scene is almost hard to process because it arrives after so much dread. 13 figures on a muddy shelf, all still there. Volanthen asks how many of them there are. A voice answers, 13. He tells them they are very strong. The boys ask, what day is it? They've been trapped long enough for time to come loose. That question cuts deeper than almost anything else. What day is it? Not, when are we getting out? Not, where is everybody? First, what day is it? It tells you how far they had traveled from ordinary life and how thin the thread back to it had become. Adil Samon, one of the boys, helped communicate in English with the rescuers. In that tiny exchange, in that wet chamber with lamps cutting through black air, the rescue shifted from search to extraction, and the problem became both better and harder all at once. Finding the team alive did not mean the crisis was close to ending. In some ways, it made the stakes even sharper. Now the world knew exactly what had to be saved and exactly how hard it would be to save it. The boys were weak from days without food. None of them were trained cave divers. The route back included stretches of full submersion through tight, muddy passages where even expert divers had to work with extreme caution. Some sections were so narrow that air tanks had to be maneuvered through rock constraints with surgical precision. Waiting months for the monsoon to end was one option people discussed, but oxygen levels in the chamber had fallen to around 15%, well below normal air. Heavy new rains were expected. Teaching the boys to dive sounded possible in theory, but if even one child panicked underwater in a narrow, flooded passage, that panic could kill the child and imperil the rescuer attached to him. Drilling from above was considered, But locating and reaching the exact chamber through the mountain was uncertain and dangerously slow. Every option carried huge risk. The problem was not choosing a safe plan. It was choosing the least impossible one. As supplies began reaching the boys, the rescuers tried to stabilize what they could. Food was delivered. Medical assessments were made. Airlines and staging areas were improved. Divers recherches endlessly. International experts kept arriving. Among the most critical of them was Dr. Richard Harris, an Australian anesthetist and experienced cave diver. His role became central because the rescue would ultimately hinge on a frightening but necessary truth. The boys could not simply swim their way out awake and frightened through hours of flooded, claustrophobic tunnels. The final plan required each boy to be escorted individually by divers, wearing a full-face mask, and to be heavily sedated so panic could not set in underwater. It was an extraordinary medical and rescue gamble. The kind of idea that sounds impossible until every other idea sounds worse. If a sedated child's mask failed, the consequences would be immediate. If a child woke and panicked in a constricted, submerged corridor, the consequences could be just as fatal. The plan demanded exact timing, constant monitoring, and nerves steady enough to carry a child through black water with one hand on the guideline and the other hand on hope. Before that plan could be carried out, the rescue effort suffered a tragic loss that reminded everyone how lethal the cave remained, even for highly trained adults. On July 6th, former Thai Navy SEAL Saman Kinnan died during an operation to place air tanks along the rescue route. He had been delivering cylinders deeper inside the cave and was returning to a staging base when he lost consciousness. He died of asphyxiation. He was only 37 years old. His death struck the rescue camp like a warning written in stone. If a fit, experienced diver could die in those flooded tunnels while carrying out support work, then what did that say about asking exhausted boys to pass through the same terrain? Saman's death did not end the rescue effort, but it changed the emotional weight of every decision that followed. No one could pretend anymore that this was simply difficult. It was deadly. Every tank, every line, every movement now took place under the fresh knowledge that one rescuer had already given his life trying to bring these children home. That loss sharpened the urgency around the final decision. Rain was expected again. Water levels could rise. Oxygen where the boys were sheltering could drop further. The rescue team moved toward action. Dr. Harris and others assessed the boys. The divers planned the exact order of extraction. Equipment was staged throughout the cave so that each section of the journey could be supported. The route from the chamber to the entrance was not one continuous swim. It was a brutal sequence of submerged stretches, muddy ledges, air pockets, narrow bends, and handoffs between teams positioned through the cave. Each boy would be dressed in protective gear, fitted with a full-face mask, sedated, and then guided or carried through the dark route by expert divers. At points, the boys would be moved on stretchers across dry sections. Sedation would have to be carefully maintained. Masks would have to stay perfectly sealed. Divers would have to remain calm, even if visibility vanished and rock pressed in on all sides. The entire mission rested on people performing flawlessly in the worst possible working conditions, without the luxury of a single major mistake. On July 8th, the first extraction day began. Outside the cave, the air was thick with waiting. Families, officials, volunteers, and reporters all understood that once the mission started, hours would pass before anyone knew whether the plan was actually working. Inside, divers reached the chamber and prepared the first 4 boys. Imagine what that must have felt like from the boys' perspective. After more than 2 weeks of darkness, hunger, and uncertainty, someone is telling you that now is the time. You're going to leave, but not by walking, not by riding anything, not by holding your breath and dashing through a pool. You're going to be masked, medicated, and carried out through flooded rock by strangers in diving gear. It demanded a kind of trust almost impossible to picture. Child-sized bodies were placed in the hands of rescuers, one by one, and then vanished back into the dark water toward a route so dangerous that the adults guiding them could not know with certainty how the day would end. The first 4 boys made it out on July 8th. Each successful emergence from the cave mouth felt like a collective release of air for the entire world. Ambulances waited. Helicopters stood ready. Medical teams rushed the boys away for treatment and isolation at the hospital in Chiang Rai. Outside, people did not celebrate wildly yet because the cave still held 8 more boys and their coach. Success on the first day proved the method could work, but it did not remove the risk of failure on the second or third. The cave remained what it had been from the start: narrow, flooded, and unforgiving. Still, the emotional shift after those first 4 rescues was enormous. The impossible plan had become a real one. If 4 could come out, maybe all 13 could. That hope ran through the rescue site like electricity, but beneath it there was still exhaustion, technical strain, and the knowledge that each trip inward and outward demanded everything from the divers involved. On July 9th, the second day of extraction, the process resumed. Another 4 boys were prepared and brought through the system. By now, the rescue was operating under intense pressure from time and weather, but also under the strain of pure exhaustion. Every team member knew that doing something once is not the same as doing it again under deep fatigue. Cylinders had to be replaced. Routes had to be checked. Medical protocols had to hold. The divers had to descend back into the cave and repeat a procedure that most people would have considered too dangerous to attempt even once, let alone multiple times. Yet they did it, and by the end of the second day, 8 boys were out. The world could begin to imagine the finish line, but finish lines can be deceptive. The last stage of any rescue can become the most dangerous because nerves start reaching toward relief before the danger has actually passed. Inside the mountain, there were still 4 boys and Ekaphon waiting in the chamber, and until they too crossed into daylight, nothing was finished. The final day, July 10th, carried a different emotional charge. This was the day that would decide whether the rescue became a near miracle or a story forever shadowed by the ones who did not make it. The remaining 4 boys and the assistant coach were extracted. Along with them, the last of the medics, divers, and rescue workers deep inside the cave began making their way out. Then, as if to remind everyone how narrow the margin always was, flooding inside the cave reportedly intensified not long after the final extraction. It was one of those moments that makes people look back and feel their stomach drop. They had not beaten the cave by much. They had beaten it just enough. When the last boy and then the coach emerged, the rescue operation crossed from grueling endurance into absolute release. After 18 days, every trapped member of the Wild Boars and their assistant coach had been brought out alive. It remains one of the rare disaster stories where the ending still feels almost too generous to believe. The names of the rescuers now sit in public memory, but in real time, this was never the work of a few men acting alone. It was layers upon layers of flawless coordination. Thai Navy personnel, local volunteers, international cave divers, engineers, doctors, police, soldiers, officials who managed airspace, roads, communications, and heavy equipment. There were people carrying tanks through knee-deep mud, people monitoring the continuous pumps, and people feeding the thousands of workers. There were families waiting through every hour without being able to do the one thing they most wanted, which was to go inside themselves and pull their children out. Rescue on this scale is never just one act of courage. It is a machine built from hundreds of smaller acts that have to align perfectly. One team lays lines. Another pumps water. Another checks masks. Another prepares hospital rooms. Another watches the weather radar. Another keeps parents informed. Another turns a chaotic entrance area into something that functions under extreme pressure. When the world later condensed the story into hero names, it was understandable, but the full truth is much broader. This rescue worked because individual brilliance found its foundation inside collective effort. Still, some names do hold a special place in how the story is remembered. John Volanthen and Rick Stanton were the British cave divers who found the team alive on July 2nd after pushing through that flooded route when the search still had no guarantee of success. Richard Harris, the Australian cave diver and anesthetist, played a decisive role in making the final extraction plan medically possible, personally assessing the boys and establishing the sedation approach that prevented underwater panic. Ekaphon Kanthawong, the assistant coach, became one of the defining figures inside the cave itself, helping keep the boys calm during those long days with almost no food. Adil Samon became the voice many people remember from the discovery moment because he was able to communicate fluently in English with the divers. And Samon Kunin became the ultimate symbol of sacrifice within a rescue, a former Thai Navy SEAL who died trying to support children he had never met. These people occupied very different positions in the crisis, but together they shaped its emotional structure: endurance, finding, planning, speaking, risking, and in one tragic case, dying. What makes the Tam Luang rescue grip people so deeply is not just that all 13 survived. It is that the obstacles were stacked so brutally against them. The boys were young. The cave was flooded. The route was long and technically vicious. The weather threatened to get worse. Oxygen was dropping. A rescuer had already died. There was no safe way out in the ordinary sense. The final method sounded closer to a desperate medical gamble than a standard rescue procedure. And yet, the operation did not collapse into chaos or ego. The people involved argued, planned, recalculated, and then committed completely. One of the reasons this story after the operation, Thai officials promised to help. On September 26, 2018, the 3 boys in Ekafon were officially granted Thai citizenship. It is one of the most quietly moving details in the entire story. These children came out of the cave alive and stepped not only back into sunlight, but more fully into belonging. A rescue that began as a fight against rising water also became, for some of them, a crossing into legal recognition they had never possessed before. In a story this huge, that detail could easily be lost, but it shouldn't be. There is a temptation with famous rescues to smooth them into simple inspiration, to tell them as if hope alone solved the problem. That is a great disservice to what actually happened at Tam Luang. Hope mattered, yes, but hope alone does not navigate flooded limestone passages. Hope does not place guide ropes, calculate oxygen needs, sedate children safely, or carry heavy tanks through blinding mud. What happened there was hope tied tightly to competence. It was people using the absolute best of what they knew under conditions that punished error immediately. That is why the story stays powerful years later. It doesn't ask you to believe in miracles detached from reality. It asks you to witness what human beings can sometimes do when they refuse to surrender to a terrible set of facts. The facts were awful. 13 trapped in a cave. Monsoon water rising. No easy route. A dead rescuer. And still, the answer was not resignation. It was work. More work than most people can picture, done in conditions few would willingly enter once, let alone again and again. One of the most unforgettable images from the rescue is not the moment the boys came out. It is the moment before that, when they were first found, faces in the dark asking what day it is. That question compresses the whole ordeal into one human beat. Time had completely dissolved for them. The outside world had become abstract. The cave had replaced normal life so completely that even the calendar no longer held. When people remember the story, they often remember the helicopters, the pumps, the divers, and the maps. But at its center is that simple, disoriented question from a child who had been underground too long. There's a reason so many accounts of the operation dwell on scale and geography. A person hearing the story for the first time can easily understand children trapped in a cave. It takes much more effort to understand what kind of cave this was and why the rescue bordered on the unthinkable. Some passages were tight enough to strip away any illusion of freedom. You were not swimming in open space. You were threading a human body through solid stone and rushing floodwater. That harsh physical reality is what gives the rescue its lingering emotional weight. The danger was not abstract. It pressed heavily from all sides. When the last child was out and the final medical checks began, what spread through the camp was not just celebration. It was exhaustion finally released. People who had been holding themselves tight for days could finally breathe differently. Parents could move toward their sons without the mountain between them. Volunteers who had sloshed through mud and sleepless nights could let the adrenaline drain away. Around the world, viewers who had been following updates from phones and television screens felt that unusual thing a public rescue can create, a kind of shared relief among complete strangers. For once, the ending did not demand that people make peace with mass loss. For once, the children came home. That outcome gave the story a brightness most survival tales never get. Yet, the brightness is strongest when you remember how unlikely it truly was. 13 out alive, in a flooded cave, after 18 days, carried one by one through passages that had already taken a rescuer's life. The scale of that improbability is exactly why people still speak of it with wonder. And maybe that is where the deepest meaning of the Tam Luang rescue lives. Not in the headlines, not in the documentaries, not even in the stunning footage of the discovery, but in the fact that a group of boys entered a mountain on an ordinary June day and vanished into danger, and the response was not indifference. People came. They came from nearby villages, from Thai government units, from foreign rescue communities, from medical specialties, from military backgrounds, and from engineering teams, from every level where skill might matter. They came because 13 lives in the dark were worth crossing borders and professional boundaries for. They came because each difficult step opened the possibility of the next one. And when the boys were finally brought out into daylight between July 8th and July 10th, what emerged with them was more than relief. It was a story the world badly needed. Proof that under pressure, human beings can still choose patience over panic, expertise over spectacle, cooperation over pride, and life over surrender, even when the way back to the surface runs through flooded stone and almost no room at all.